Peter, where are you on it?
Well, I don't see a problem. If you find oil which is exploitable at a reasonable price within your territory, then you do it. There are lots of arguments about what you do with the revenue and who gets the revenue, but beyond that, it doesn't seem to me to be any kind of difficulty.
So you're not a problem from Peter's side, Aaron?
I would oppose it, but what I would say is lots of the arguments in regards to this find being tapped revolve around energy security. And that is completely misrepresentative of how this works. Rosebank oil fields being exploited will in no way help UK energy security or reduce the cost of energy for the average UK punter. This is energy which will be available on a global market for a global price. There will, of course, be taxes raised, which is a very valuable, important thing to say. But I do think in selling this kind of undertaking, politicians overstate the case for drilling.
Do they?
I think they probably do, yes, but it doesn't alter the fact that, as Aaron rightly says, there will be tax revenue to this country. What this country does with the tax revenue is an interesting point. It's quite often argued, and I think with some strength, that if we'd done what Norway had done with the original tax revenues from North Sea oil that we had over that long period, instead of spending it all on helping make the country more unemployed, then we would be much better off as a country than we are now. And I would like some consideration on that. But no, I think that there's an overstatement by politicians about energy security, which doesn't seem to me to hold much water. But that's probably being made to cover up for the fact that they're all very, very afraid of the net zero people who are going to say leave it in the ground, which is by and large their belief. That itself is based on this weird fallacy that the sky above us is divided, and that if Britain behaves in this way, that all the other countries in the world that are pulling oil and coal and gas out of the ground will either follow our example or will be deeply affected by our minor contribution to keeping it in the ground, which they won't be.
And I just wonder, anyone at home, are you anywhere near Shetland? I think it's just west of Shetland now. Are you in that area? How do you feel having this on your doorstep? Because some people, they don't, I'm just showing you the map, actually. It's all well and good kind of sitting in a remote distance, say, yeah, let's get the drilling commencing. But if it's in your neighbourhood, your back garden, do you support it or not? Just to give you a little bit of context here, they reckon production will begin 2026, 2027. In terms of jobs, 1,600 jobs perhaps at the peak, with about 450 ongoing. When we talk about what we're going to do with this stuff once we've got it produced, do you think there is any merit to a suggestion that, you know what, rather than creating this for export, why don't we create this, produce it for domestic use only? Would you support that kind of thing, or is that market manipulation? Is that anti-capitalism? What?
Well, you sound very sensible saying that, Michelle.
I'm a sensible individual.
And I would say it's better to keep it in the ground. I probably have quite fundamental disagreements with Peter around net zero. But I think that would be a much more interesting conversation, because if you said, look, we import 50% of our gas every year, which we do, and obviously that means that we're so at the behest of volatile energy prices, as we saw last year, doesn't it make sense, given we are a massive producer of energy, to, like you say, store much more of it here? That would be a sensible conversation. Or indeed, to say, well, look, this is going to raise lots of money, we need to exploit it, and let's invest that into retrofitting homes to make them more energy efficient, or research and development in post-carbon technologies. That would all be very interesting. I might not agree with it, but if the government did that, I'd say, OK, that's not the worst thing to happen. But what we would have, I think, instead, is tax breaks for SPIVs, handouts for business allies, friends and cronies of the government, or just fundamental misspending of it. And I think that to me is the real downside. Let's say if there was $5 billion a year generated in tax from this, where would it go? I suspect the Tories would say, let's scrap inheritance tax. So that is precisely why this kind of exploitation of resources is just completely off the table.
Is he being a bit cynical there, do you think?
No, he's just being political. He doesn't like the idea that inheritance tax should be scrapped, and so he derides it as a misuse of the money. It seems to me to be a perfectly possible use of the money. I know quite why you should take money away from people when they die after they've paid tax on it several times already. I'm not sure why this is a particularly just activity, and if you can spare them from it, then all well and good. Lots of other things, from social care to the terrible state of our infrastructure, which needs to be dealt with, which we could spend money on. It'd be nice to have the money, but what is fatuous, it seems to me, is to imagine that by keeping it in the ground we would do anything but harm to ourselves.
Yeah, see, and I think that's very reasonable, do you not? Always say?
I think, look, fundamentally, we're moving away from fossil fuels over the next 20 to 30 years in a range of areas, and either we're prepared for that or not. So right now, the big problem, and this is just sort of indisputable, is storage. That's the big problem. We can generate lots of electricity at an ever cheaper rate from things like wind, from solar, but the problem is storage. Once that is overcome, then my worry, Michelle, is actually that countries like the UK and the United States, which are beholden to oil, gas, will be a step behind at places like China, who, yes, have lots of coal being burnt right now, but are also massive global market leaders in renewable technology, because they will have, in 20, 30 years, because of decisions like this, cheaper energy than us. I think a fundamental political flaw over the last 30, 40 years is a lack of long-term planning when it comes to energy, industrial policy, and really, what's this country going to look like, and what kind of living standards, not just will we have, but our children and our grandchildren. And so, like I say, if there was a Tory politician, while this was being exploited, saying, you know what, we're going to spend this on R&D for a post-carbon economy, we're going to invest this in infrastructure like Peter says, I might be more sympathetic. And Peter says, on the one hand, in the 80s, if only we'd had a Norwegian sovereign wealth fund, which I agree with, you can't maintain that position and then say at the same time, oh, well, we're having a smaller bonanza now, but let's instead spend it on, you know, scrapping inheritance tax.
Well, I'm not really saying that. I'm just saying that you picked on inheritance tax as a thing, and for political reasons. I wouldn't have thought that's how it's going to go anyway. I think it'd probably be more expensive to get rid of inheritance tax than that. But there are some illusions here among the net zero people. And one, the idea that imposing net zero on our economy isn't going to be quite bad for people's standards of living, for how cold they are in the winter, for how expensive life is, and for employment, because it will be. The other, this wonderful thing, well, if only we could solve the problem of electricity storage, then everything would be all right. It's like, if only we could solve the problem of nuclear fusion, which people have been bashing away at now for decades, and it's always just on the edge of being solved and never is. It's almost like saying, if only we could solve the problem of perpetual motion, we wouldn't have to worry about anything. The trouble is, these are major, really major scientific problems which have not been solved, and we delude ourselves. First, I was in the Netherlands the other day, and I had the joy of rushing past on an electric train a coal-fired power station, which was almost certainly producing power to charge electric cars in this country, because we can't do it ourselves, because our own power grid is now so wind dependent that we have to constantly suck power in from countries on the continent to keep the place going. And the more wind dependent we are, and the more, say, electric cars we have, the more dependent we are on imported electricity from places like the Netherlands, and also the French nuclear electricity, which environmentalists disapprove of.
Well, I'm pro-nuclear, don't worry, Peter.
Well, good for you.
We agree on that.
Well, there you go. We end on a point of agreement.